Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Lynch. I'm Chief of Educational Programs at the Army Heritage and Education Center. Welcome to the inaugural General of the Army Omar N. Bradley Memorial Lecture, which launches our Perspectives in Military History lecture series. This lecture is sponsored jointly by the Army Heritage and Education Center and the Omar N. Bradley Foundation. Our speaker, Dr. Mark Neely, will arrive in just a moment, but before he begins, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. First, when the lights dim, please stand for Dr. Neely. Please turn off all cell phones and pagers while you're in Bliss Hall. We do not want to disturb either Dr. Neely or other visitors during the presentation. Dr. Neely will take questions at the end of his lecture. If you do have a question, please note that each of your seats has a microphone. If you would like to ask a question, please stand and use your microphone so that we can both hear your question and capture the question on camera. Push the button when you're ready to talk and hold down the button for the entire time you're speaking. After you're finished, release that button so that everything else doesn't get captured as well. After the question and answer session, Dr. Neely will be available to sign books up here on the stage. The flow will be as follows, and I'll remind you about this after we finish. Please, all rows, move toward the center and walk up to the center of the stage, and then after Dr. Neely signs your book, you may go off on either side, left or right. Thank you for your cooperation, and I might also add, just before we begin signing books, we will be taking some photos with Dr. Neely at the flags at the left-hand side of the stage, so please allow us to get those done before you start coming up on the stage. And now, please stand for Dr. Neely. Ladies and gentlemen, the Director of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Viney.
Thank you. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to see such a great turnout for tonight's presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would just like to thank Kevin Searfoss from Executive Services for his assistance in putting tonight's events together. And I would also like to thank our own Mike Lynch from the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center's Visitor and Education Services Directorate. Mike does a wonderful job coordinating our two lecture series, which are important components of US AHEC's mission to educate the Army and the public on the heritage of the Army and its contributions to our nation and its way of life. So thanks again to Kevin and Mike. It's now my pleasure to introduce a great scholar, Dr. Mark E. Neely. Dr. Neely is the McCabe Greer Professor of Civil War History at the Pennsylvania State University. He is an author on the U.S. Civil War in general and in Abraham Lincoln in particular. He earned his undergraduate degree in American Studies at Yale University in 1966, and he earned his Ph.D. in history at the same school in 1973. Dr. Neely began his teaching career as a visiting instructor at Iowa State University from 1971 to 1972, and then he assumed the directorship of the Lincoln Museum at Fort Wayne, Indiana, a position he held for 20 years. In 1992, Dr. Neely was named the John Francis Bannon Professor of History and American Studies at St. Louis University. In 1998, he went to Penn State, where he assumed the McCabe Greer Professor of Civil War History, where he remains today. Dr. Neely is best known for his 1991 book, The Fate of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln and Civil Liberties, which won both the Pulitzer Prize in 1992 and the Bell Irwin Wiley Prize the following year. In March 1991, he also published an article in the magazine Civil War History entitled, Was the Civil War a Total War?, which was chosen as one of the top 3 most influential articles on the war written in the last half of the 20th century by Civil War History magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Neely.
Well, thanks a lot. I know that those of you who are in the program here are going to go to Gettysburg at the end of the week. And I just couldn't figure out how to start a Civil War lecture with Gettysburg. So I'm going to start with Bull Run, all right? I want to do that because I think that it's very difficult for us to recover the significance of the Battle of Bull Run. For example, I don't think you'll ever quite recover its significance if you refer to it as the first Battle of Bull Run, because that means that you know there's a second Battle of Bull Run coming and a lot of others that are deemed now greater battles of far greater scale and in some ways of greater consequences. And so in order to recover a sense of what the Battle of Bull Run meant, we have to think about it in the way that the people did at the time. Just to give you some idea of its significance compared to later battles, briefly, I'm sure you know, but the casualties on either side were, well, roughly speaking, say 2,000. And, 3 years later, Robert E. Lee, in 1 month of campaigning, loses, essentially the whole Bull Run Army. And Grant a Bull Run Army and a half in a month. And so that's why it has shrunk in significance, but it was very significant to the people at the time. And historians now are beginning to realize that it had tactical and psychological significance. James McPherson, for example, says that the Battle of Bull Run essentially scared the North off from attacking the South in the East for some 8 months. And if you read Michael C.C. Adams on the significance of the Battle of Bull Run, while he will tell you that it essentially unhinged much of the press, some generals, and even many Union soldiers, he would say. Suddenly there were fears, kind of secret fears, he says, that the Confederates might really be superior and couldn't be beaten by the likes of the shopkeepers and factory workers from the northern cities. William T. Sherman was there, and the battle, in a way, scared him out of his wits. And he was, for a time afterwards, much troubled and exaggerated the size of the armies that he faced. I have trouble imagining something that would scare William T. Sherman. So that helped me appreciate that it had a greater significance then than we're able to recapture now. So the particular significance, of course, was the national trauma. And when the Union armies broke on the afternoon of July 21st, of course, they didn't retreat. They panicked. If you read the magazines and the newspapers at the time afterwards, you will see large numbers of articles that are about panic or panic terror, they said, in the armies. And people at the time didn't know more battles were coming, and they thought that this one, therefore, was of great significance and that the message from it was very gloomy. And one of the things that I think we fail to appreciate about the significance of the Battle of Bull Run at the time, what made it more humiliating than necessary by far, is that its result was broadcast to the world by the world's only war correspondent, William Howard Russell of the London Times. Russell is generally credited with being the world's first newspaper war correspondent. He had covered the Crimea. He had covered the Indian Mutiny. And he came to the United States to cover the American Civil War. He was in Washington, but so many people left Washington that day to go out and watch the battle. They'd rented all the horses and carriages. And he had trouble finding a horse to rent. So by the time he arrived at the battlefield, in fact, all he could witness was the retreat. That's all he saw. And so he then broadcast to the world this dismaying picture of what had happened to the Union armies at Bull Run. And it spread alarm. I'll give you an example. This is from the New York Evening Post, which said after the Battle of Bull Run, "What is the value of free institutions if they do not make us more valiant men?" Well, if we think about the Battle of Bull Run, it's easy for us to think of Confederate heroes it made. In the short run, I guess it made P.G.T. Beauregard a hero. It made Joseph E. Johnston a hero. In the long run, forever, it made Stonewall Jackson a hero. It's a little more difficult to think of heroes on the northern side, but there was one. It's by and large gone unnoticed to this day. It was unnoticed at the time. But to me, the real hero of the Battle of Bull Run is the United States Constitution. Because almost all historians say now about the aftermath of the Bull Run battle, sure, it was a defeat. Sure, it was temporarily humiliating and worrisome. But in the long run, it had a galvanizing effect. And this was a point at which people in the North realized that the challenge was very great, and they were going to have to do very great things to meet it. James McPherson, for example, says of it, the deep, long-lasting impact of Bull Run on the North was not defeatism, but renewed determination. But to me, that doesn't quite go far enough. Because, I think we should ask, well, what made a long-term outcome possible? And that was the Constitution and a presidential form of government. So if you just use your historical imagination for a minute, you can understand this. What would happen in the United States in 1861 had we had a parliamentary form of government? Think of what the outcome of after the Battle of Bull Run would have been had we had a parliamentary government like Great Britain's. Here's what I think happens. The Lincoln administration falls one way or another, maybe on a vote of no confidence. Abraham Lincoln then is president of the United States for 5 months. And we might not be as lucky as Great Britain in World War II and not get Winston Churchill in a coalition government. But instead, well, if we had a coalition government after Lincoln fell in the summer of 1861, it wouldn't be led by Stephen Douglas because Stephen Douglas had just died in June. So I figure the likely compromise candidate to lead that government would be James R. Doolittle of Wisconsin. So President Doolittle then would have led the country for the rest of the war. Well, if the Lincoln administration didn't fall in July of 1861, it's a cinch it would have fallen 1 year later. Because 1 year later, of course, George B. McClellan, who had organized the greatest army that had ever been formed on the continent, marched that army so close to Richmond that the soldiers could hear the bells toll in the city, and then met defeat in the 7 days battles in the Peninsula Campaign. Ironically, just as people in the North are getting ready to celebrate the 4th of July. Not much of a celebration. And so the trauma was even greater after the failure on the Peninsula, deeper than in 1861. And I can't see that the Lincoln administration would have possibly lasted had there been a way to get it out of there. But there wasn't. And so I'd put it, with a parliamentary form of government, Lincoln's term maximum would have been 17 months. And that means, of course, that there wouldn't be any great emancipator, because the Emancipation Proclamation came after July of 1862 even. So to me, in a way, the country was saved by the Constitution. Lincoln didn't have to suffer a vote of confidence. They didn't have to reorganize a government. The same government remained in place. The same Republican administration determined to batter the Confederacy into submission. Well, why is it, to me, I wonder why people have so much trouble seeing the Constitution as a hero. And I think partly it's because we look for heroes in other areas, and also the Constitution is a document, it's not a person. But I do think we want to consider the Constitution as having a more heroic role than is usually given it. I will say also that one of the reasons we have trouble thinking of the Constitution that way is the way that it's been written about to this day. And the standard work on the Constitution in the Civil War, on the Constitution in the North in the Civil War, I brought it with me. It's Constitutional Problems Under Lincoln by James G. Randall, pretty formidable book. This is the 1951 edition. It's all I have. I don't have a first edition of it. And that's because the book is darn near 100 years old. It was first published in 1926. And so our history, the standard history of the Constitution during the American Civil War, is now getting on 100. And, you know, you want to think also that during the Civil War, there wasn't just one Constitution. That was the problem. There were two. And the Confederate Constitution, the Confederacy, there is no constitutional history of the Confederacy. So the constitutional history of the Union is 85 years old, and the standard constitutional of the Confederacy isn't. And that, I think, has caused this problem. And that is that the legacy of this book, this is a solid book, as you can tell. It's balanced, and the coverage is kind of wonderful in a way. But it left us with the wrong impression. It left us with the idea that the Constitution was a problem. And so that when we go to look and study the Constitution during the Civil War, we say, oh, it's going to be a problem. And I think that what we need to do is to think that the Constitution wasn't a problem, or at least it wasn't always a problem. It was also, in many ways, an asset. And if you just say that to yourself, it's kind of magical. You'll immediately think of, oh, sure, there's this provision and that provision in the Constitution that, in fact, would be a great asset in a war. And, of course, we've already touched on the two most obvious ones for the American Civil War. Article 2, Section 1 gives the president a 4-year term. Article 2, Section 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief. Now, the Civil War began at the beginning of a president's term because that man was elected president, right? And so these two provisions together, in some ways, helped decide the outcome of the Civil War. They meant that a Republican determined to defeat the Confederacy was going to be sitting in Washington, wielding all the manpower and resources of the United States to pound the Confederacy into submission. He was going to be there for 4 long years, unless he was impeached or assassinated, and no one at the time thought that was possible, least of all Abraham Lincoln. If those things don't happen, well, then everyone in the world knew that Lincoln would be sitting in the White House, ordering soldiers by the tens of thousands to attack the Confederacy, all the way up to the next presidential inauguration, which was in March of 1865. That's a long time. No one knew that better than Jefferson Davis. Now use your historical imagination, all right? Imagine yourself in Jefferson Davis's shoes. If you're sitting in the Confederate Capitol in April of 1861, in the aftermath of the fall of Fort Sumter, well, you briefly savor this bloodless victory, and then you look at a map, and then you say, uh-oh, because there's going to be no regime change in Washington before March of 1865. Your implacable enemies are just across the Potomac or just across the Ohio River from you. Jefferson Davis knew that. Jefferson Davis had read the United States Constitution. He knew who would be the commander-in-chief until March of 1865. And that made a big difference. Now, I'm going to back off a little here. I'm not going to argue tonight that the Constitution was the hero of the Civil War. and if I may occasionally slip and say that it determined the outcome of the Civil War, but that's a slip. Okay, I'm trying not to do that. I'm not going to say it caused Union victory. But I do think it's important that we get the idea, when we study the Civil War, that the Constitution was, in the words of the historian Arthur Bester, that the Constitution was configurative, that it shaped the war in many critical ways. And the most positive point of that is, don't think of it only as a problem. Think of it also as an asset. Okay, we've already seen the principal ways in which it was an asset. The Constitution allowed a determined and able Republican president to ignore military defeats and to search for commanders and strategies that would bring victory, as it turned out, in 4 years' time. There were two other ways, at least, in which the Constitution's role was critical. And, well, to illustrate it, let's go back and get in Jefferson Davis's shoes for a minute and think of the prospect he faced of having to deal with Abraham Lincoln, knowing he was going to have to deal with Abraham Lincoln as an adversary for 4 years. Well, in fact, I think that substantially explains Confederate grand strategy. Armchair historians to this day and Monday morning quarterbacks and such, they always wonder why it is that the Confederacy squandered one of its greatest advantages, being on the defensive, in an era in which many people thought the odds for the defense were very great. Why did it embark then on offensive military campaigns that, as it turned out, brought signal defeats like Antietam and like Gettysburg, that a defeat you're going to see, some of you, at the end of the week? Well, the answer for that, the answer for throwing away their best card, was that Jefferson Davis knew that a defensive war would have to last 4 long years, and that he would be put in the position, not one enviable for a popularly elected president, of having to turn to the people and say, okay, now just hunker down for 4 years. Sure, they're going to throw everything at you. You're going to be bombarded. Life's going to be wretched. You're going to be blockaded, but just take it. And in 4 long years, assuming he's not reelected, and in March of 1865, it'll all be over. You can't do that. Jefferson Davis couldn't do that. No one else occupying the presidency of the Confederacy could do that. He had to tell the people he was going to do something. He had to do something. And so doing something meant going on the offensive when the opportunity permitted. Now, to point out what I think is the second, which would be the fourth of the great advantages, another advantage that the Constitution gave the North during the Civil War, it's going to require us to take on a kind of a foreign concept here, and that is the idea of an unwritten Constitution. Now, we all know that Great Britain claims to have an unwritten Constitution, and we have a written one, right? But we also have an unwritten one. And one of those unwritten provisions was critical in the Civil War and for Abraham Lincoln's success and the success of the Union. And in order to understand this piece of the unwritten Constitution, we got to go back. We got to go back to the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 was the most unpopular war by far in all of American history. The war didn't go well for the United States. Opposition to it temporarily revived the fortunes of the Federalist Party. The war was initiated by, and the administration was a Republican administration under James Madison. It breathed life back into the Federalist Party. And the Federalists in Congress, though they were a tiny minority, were unanimously opposed to the declaration of war in 1812. And afterwards, they were all but unanimously opposed to raising men or money for the war. Incidentally, my statistics here come from a very good history of the War of 1812. I think Donald R. Hickey's The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict. And he points out that the Federalists on 305 roll calls having to do with war-related measures in the Congress during the war. The Federalists had 94% voter cohesion. They were a unit against this war. And much of this opposition was concentrated in New England, where the Federalist Party was strongest. And eventually, discontent in New England grew so great that there were threats of secession. And a group of Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut, at what came to be known, generally called the notorious Hartford Convention. And there, they drew up a list of 7 constitutional amendments. And they were going to take these constitutional amendments down to Washington and give them to President Madison as apparently as some kind of ultimatum. And it's not, what are the consequences if they don't try to get these constitutional amendments through? It's not clear. But, of course, there are some veiled threats of secession in New England. No one knows exactly what their purposes were. And we'll never know exactly because, as it turned out, when the Hartford Convention had decided on its 7 possible amendments to the Constitution, they went to Washington and were greeted with the news of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans. And that pulled the rug out from under this movement. They were immediately regarded as traitors, and the Federalist Party collapsed. Every single politician in America in the rest of the 19th century knew that. They knew that you cannot vote against supplies for troops that are already in the field. It is political suicide. No one knew that lesson better than Abraham Lincoln. During his single term in the United States House of Representatives, he had, like most of the rest of the people in the Whig Party, he was a Whig then, he had opposed the Mexican-American War. And then years later, when he was running for the Senate in Illinois in 1858, the famous debates campaign against Stephen A. Douglas, the Democrats researched his record, of course, and they discovered that Lincoln, if they didn't already know, had opposed the Mexican War, and they were going to use it against him in the campaign. When the Republicans heard about this, it made them worried. And so the editor of the Chicago Tribune, a Republican paper, a man named Joseph Medill, wrote the candidate, Lincoln, to warn him about this. And Lincoln wrote back on June 25th, 1858, quote, "I was in Congress but a single term. I was a candidate when the Mexican War broke out, and I took the ground, which I never varied from, that the administration had done wrong in getting us into the war, but that the officers and soldiers who went to the field must be supplied and sustained at all events. You may safely deny that I ever gave any vote for withholding any supplies whatever from officers or soldiers of the Mexican War. I have examined the journals a good deal, and besides, I cannot be mistaken, for I had my eye always upon it." So Lincoln knew the fate of the Federalist Party, and he was not about to commit political suicide by voting against supplies for troops in the field. So Lincoln understood, as did everyone else, the unwritten Constitution. Well, as president later then, this part of the unwritten Constitution was a great benefit to Lincoln. The Democrats during the Civil War were reduced to a minority in Congress. Republicans could get mostly what they wanted. But the Democrats were great enough in number that, we'll say, they might have walked out and prevented a quorum. But they weren't about to do that. And most of the Democrats voted supplies. They were what we call a loyal opposition. Lincoln never faced what would have been called then a factious opposition from the Democrats. And it was the unwritten Constitution that guaranteed that. It was a very big asset. Well, of course, I wrote a whole book about how the Constitution was a problem, the fate of liberty, and so I'm not going to say that the Constitution caused no problems for the Civil War president. But I guess, one of the things I was sort of afraid of as I began writing this was I thought, about this time, people are going to be thinking, hold it, Mark. The Constitution may have been an asset for the North, as you say, but the South had, roughly the same Constitution. It didn't prove to be such a great asset for them. So in other words, how can I possibly argue that the Constitution was an asset in winning the war for the North without at the same time having to argue that for the Confederacy, the Constitution somehow didn't configure the war so that the South could win it? I mean, is it an advantage or isn't it, right? And so I'll have to say this troubled me a good deal. This is the answer that I have come up with that I want to try tonight. And so in about 15 minutes, I want to explain